The sky was bleeding white. Thick snow came down in sideways sheets whipped hard by wind that howled like wolves trapped between the ridgelines. Elijah Two Moons moved slow through the storm, eyes squinting, body hunched against the cold. His buckskin coat was crusted with ice, the fur collar stiff and heavy. He gripped the handle of his hatchet tight, stepping over fallen branches and fresh animal prints that led nowhere. He was looking for a snare line he'd set the day before. But even a man like him, who knew the mountains like scars on his own skin, could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then he heard it. Not an animal. Not wind. A cry. Sharp. Human. Elijah froze, one boot halfway over a snow-covered log. The sound came again, higher now, thready and quick, like someone trying to scream but failing. He adjusted his course, following the sound downhill through thick fir trees. Each step sent snow spilling off limbs in fat, silent clumps. It was hard to tell if what he heard was real or just the storm tricking his ears. Then through a break in the brush, he saw a splash of red cloth. His body moved before his mind did. He dropped low, approaching the shape carefully. There, curled at the base of a half-buried pine, was a woman. Face down, shaking. Clutched tight to her chest, wrapped in what looked like a wool shawl, was something small and moving. A baby. Elijah crouched beside her. "Miss," he said, voice steady but loud enough to cut through the wind. "You hear me?" She shifted slightly enough to show her face. Young. Mexican, maybe. Lips blue, cheeks raw with windburn. Eyes red from crying, or cold, maybe both. "Please," she rasped in a thick accent. "He's cold." "I don't—" She couldn't finish. The child whimpered, the sound barely audible now. Too weak to cry proper. Elijah reached for the shawl and the woman flinched, pulling the baby tighter. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said plainly, "but he's not gonna make it another hour out here." No answer. Only the wind and that awful thin sound of the baby trying to breathe. Elijah looked her dead in the eye. There was no time to earn trust. No time to explain. "If you need a place to not die today," he said, "there's room in my cabin." He'd strapped together a crude sled from a pine bough and rope. The woman lay atop it, wrapped in his buffalo hide, the baby against her chest. She hadn't spoken since, just held the child and stared past the trees like they weren't even there. Elijah walked ahead, pulling the sled behind. His breath came in visible clouds, boots crunching through fresh powder. His cabin was still an hour up the trail. Every so often he looked back. The woman's eyes were still open, still distant. The place wasn't much, a square log room with a stone fireplace, low bed shelf of dried meat, and a rifle mounted above the door. But it was warm and safe. Elijah got the fire roaring, then set about boiling water. The woman sat stiff on a pile of furs near the hearth, her knees drawn up, the baby still in her arms. She rocked gently, whispering something he couldn't understand. "What's his name?" Elijah asked, not expecting an answer. She looked up. "Miguelito, yours, Ruth." He nodded once, then handed her a tin cup. Warm broth, just barely seasoned. She didn't take it. "I didn't follow you to kill you," he said, not unkindly. "You're in the middle of nowhere in winter with a baby and no coat. You think I got time for games?" She reached for the cup slowly, drank, then gave the rest to the child, who made weak noises but swallowed. That's when she asked, "Why'd you stop?" Elijah stirred the fire with a stick. Sparks rose, catching the shadows. "Because not stopping would haunt me more than freezing out here alone." Ruth didn't want the bed. She insisted on sleeping near the fire. Elijah didn't argue. He laid down a thick blanket on the far end of the cabin and wrapped himself in another. He'd spent 20 years alone in these mountains. Hunters passed through, women sometimes. None stayed. None were supposed to. But this one hadn't asked to stay. She'd just asked not to die. As the fire crackled, Miguelito coughed. Ruth held him closer, humming something in Spanish. Her voice was raw but soft. Elia closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He stepped out early to check the snares. Cold bit at his nose and ears, but his hands stayed steady. He found 2 rabbits, one fresh and clean. As he turned to head back, he spotted movement on a ridge above. A silhouette. Watching. Too far to tell who or what. But it was gone in a blink. When he got back, Ruth was feeding Miguelito from a cloth-draped cup. She didn't look up. He set the rabbits down, took out his knife. "I'll make something better tonight." Still no answer. But her voice came quiet after a long pause. "You say you won't hurt me," she said. "So did the last man." Elia didn't turn, just kept skinning the rabbit. "I don't make promises," he said. "Just soup." That night, Miguelito's breath grew uneven. Ruth shook him gently. He didn't cry, didn't open his eyes. "Elia," she shouted. He was at her side in seconds. "He's burning," she cried. "His head, he's burning." Elia touched the boy's forehead. Fever high. Too high. Without a word, he grabbed his coat knife and rifle. "Where are you going?" Ruth cried. "Elia, please." He didn't look back. He stepped out into the snow, headed for the one person who might still help a stranger and her dying child. The door creaked open with a sharp groan of wood against metal. Wind poured into the cabin like a warning. Ruth stood barefoot on the fur-lined floor, her arms wrapped around Miguelito, who whimpered quietly, sweat matting his curls to his forehead. The baby's skin felt hot and dry breath shallow. Elia stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. His face was flushed with cold eyes darker than usual. In one hand he held a worn leather pouch filled with dried herbs. In the other, a heavy wool blanket already wet with melting snow. "She coming?" Ruth asked. Elia nodded, dropping the pouch near the fire. "Naomi's behind me. Gave her my coat to keep dry." Ruth didn't respond. She knelt by the fire again, rocking her son slowly, whispering words in Spanish that cracked in her throat. Moments later, another figure filled the doorway, hunched, layered in pelts, face framed by 2 long braids streaked silver. Naomi, tall elk healer of the Crow people, had the bearing of someone who took no nonsense from man nor spirit. Her eyes went straight to Ruth, then to the baby. Without a word, she knelt beside them. "Fever," Ruth whispered. "He won't wake. He won't drink." Naomi's hands were cool, and precise fingers moving over the baby's chest, his temples lifting one tiny eyelid. "Lungs are clear," she murmured, "but the heat's caught behind the eyes. Desert fever. Comes fast." Elia sat silently across the room, watching. Naomi looked up at him, nodding once approval or maybe respect. She turned to Ruth. "We'll need tea. Birch bark. Willow. Hand me that pot." Ruth didn't move. Naomi didn't soften. "You want him to live, I need your hands. Not your fear." Ruth blinked, then nodded, moving quickly. She passed the pot. Naomi poured snowmelt into it from a wooden bucket near the fire, added herbs from her pouch, and set it near the flames. "He'll drink this. Small sips warm, not hot." Elia stood to help, but Naomi shook her head. Let her do it. They worked in silence. Ruth's fingers trembled as she brought a spoon to Miguelito's lips. Most of it dribbled out. She tried again, and again. Naomi sat back, folding her arms. You're lucky, she said to Elia. I thought you forgot how to find people. I don't find people, he muttered. I found them. Naomi grunted. You never just find people. The mountain gives you who you need when you least want them. The wind outside howled harder as if agreeing. Hours passed. Miguelito stirred barely, then coughed. Weak but present. Ruth sobbed, pressing her cheek to his. Naomi reached over, steadying the boy's head. He'll rest now, she said. But this storm's not letting up tonight. You'll stay, Elia said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You asking or telling? He almost smiled. Wouldn't dare tell you anything. She nodded, removing her outer coat and hanging it by the fire. Ruth looked up. Thank you. Thank you for... Naomi cut her off gently. Don't thank me until he walks again. And maybe not even then. She leaned closer, eyes sharp. What's your name, Ruth? You running from something? Ruth's jaw tightened. Someone. Naomi didn't push. Then don't waste time running. If you're gonna stay alive here, learn the ways, learn the plants, learn the cold. You don't get a second mistake in the mountains. Ruth nodded, her lips pressed tight. Naomi turned to Elia. She's sharp. Hurt, but sharp. He said nothing. Naomi studied him a moment longer, then exhaled. Lord, you're even quieter now. You speak to her at all. She doesn't trust me. Then speak anyway. Silence is a choice, too. She turned in for the night, curling up on the floor near the fire. Ruth laid beside Miguelito, who had finally fallen into a deep sleep. The wind screeched outside, shaking the shutters. Elia remained seated against the log wall, sharpening his knife out of habit. That's when Ruth spoke so soft he almost didn't catch it. You say you won't hurt me, she said. So did the last man. Elia didn't lift his head, just kept moving the whetstone slow and steady. I don't make promises, he said. Just soup. She gave a breath of laughter, sharp and sad. That sounds like something a liar would say. He paused, then looked up. If I was lying, you wouldn't still have a son. The room fell quiet again. No more words passed between them that night. By morning, Miguelito's fever had broken. His cheeks were flushed but not burning, and his eyes opened to the light filtering through the window pane. He made a small sound, part whimper, part yawn, and reached for Ruth's finger. Ruth nearly collapsed in tears. Naomi smiled faintly. Strong boy. He'll be hungry soon. She packed her herbs, tied them into neat bundles with twine, and slipped them into her coat. You've got 1 week, she said to Ruth. Then you come down the mountain. You'll learn from me. No more hiding. No more waiting to be saved. I don't know anything, Ruth said. You know how to keep a baby alive in a blizzard. That's more than most. Naomi looked at Elia. And you? You'll bring her. Elia hesitated. Naomi narrowed her eyes. I'm not asking. I'll bring her, he said. Naomi left as she arrived without ceremony, fading into the trees like smoke. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Elia trapped rabbits. Ruth cleaned hides. Miguelito began making noise again, soft squeals and tiny laughs. At night, Ruth asked questions: how to start a fire from wet wood, how to snare a fox, which plants burned cleanest. Elia answered one sentence at a time. Ruth started cooking simple meals. She repaired one of Eliah's torn shirts without asking. On the third night, she placed his supper in front of him, then sat across the table. "You always live like this?" she asked. In silence, he met her gaze. Silence is safer. For who, she asked. He didn't answer. That evening, while gathering firewood near the ridge, Eliah caught sight of footprints in the snow. Not fresh, but not old either. Boot prints, wide and deep. Someone had been nearby. He knelt beside them, pressing his fingers into the impression, judging weight, direction. They weren't his, and they weren't Ruth's. They were heading north, back toward Bridger's Pass. He returned to the cabin late, Ruth already asleep beside Miguelito. But he didn't go inside. Instead, Elias stood at the tree-line rifle slung low, eyes scanning the dark. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know when something or someone was circling back. The path to Naomi's cabin was narrow, carved between frost-bitten pine trunks, and a stream frozen solid in mid-motion. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, now the storm easing, but the cold hanging heavy like a warning that hadn't finished being spoken. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Miguelito was tucked close to her chest, swaddled in Eliah's old wool coat. His fever had broken days ago, but he still slept more than he should. She could feel every tremble of his body through the layers. It made her legs feel hollow, but she kept walking. Eliah walked ahead as always. He didn't speak much, never had, but his presence was steady, predictable. The way he moved through the forest made it feel smaller, like the wilderness bent around him just a little. They reached a clearing where smoke coiled from the crooked chimney of a single-room lodge built low into the slope. Naomi stood outside, arms folded, watching them, like she'd known exactly what moment they'd appear. "I told you 1 week," she said. "Not 3 days." "He still won't drink much," Ruth said quietly. "And I want to learn." Naomi stared at her a long moment, unreadable, then turned her back and opened the door. "Then come in," she said. "But leave the lies outside." Inside, the warmth was almost dizzying. The place smelled of spruce ash and dried herbs. Long bundles of wild sage, chokecherry bark, and bearberry leaves hung from the rafters. Jars lined one entire wall, roots, seeds, powders, things Ruth couldn't name but felt drawn to. Naomi motioned to a soft elk hide laid near the fire. "Lay the boy there," she said. "I'll watch his breath while I talk." Ruth obeyed. Eliah leaned near the door, arms crossed, watching, always watching. Naomi knelt beside Miguelito, pressing her ear to his chest. "Strong heart," she muttered, "but weak energy. Something's still lingering." "Is it the fever?" Ruth asked. Naomi glanced up. Could be. Could be something else. She reached for a small jar, scooped something black and sticky onto her finger, and rubbed it gently along Miguelito's gums. "What is that?" Ruth asked. Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she looked Ruth dead in the eye and said, "The mountain takes children who don't drink, and mothers who don't ask." Ruth blinked. "I'm asking now." Naomi nodded, satisfied. She stood and moved to a table at the back of the room where a stack of leather-bound books sat under a cloth. "You're city-born," Naomi said. "You read." "Yes," Ruth said, surprised. "Good. These will teach you what you can't hear. But healing don't live on pages alone. You'll learn with your hands, your ears, your mistakes." "I want to," Ruth said. "For him." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Just for him," Ruth hesitated. "For me too, I don't want to run anymore." Eliah shifted at the door. Ruth glanced back at him, but he didn't meet her gaze. Naomi smirked slightly. Well, about time. She spent the rest of the day showing Ruth how to steep bone-set tea, how to boil yarrow root without killing its strength, how to smell spoiled elderberries from good ones. She pointed to each bundle by name, made Ruth repeat them, asked her to tie new ones with fresh string. Ruth's fingers trembled, but not from cold. Her world, once full of silence, fear, and waiting, now moved with purpose, weight, and words she didn't know yet. Her son slept beside the fire. She was learning how to protect him without waiting for someone else to do it. Late in the afternoon, Naomi sent Elia to chop wood behind the lodge. Once he was gone, she sat across from Ruth and asked, "You know what people are saying?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't know any people. They're saying he's gone soft, letting a stranger stay, raising a child not his own." Ruth's face tightened. "We didn't ask for pity or shelter. I'm not blaming you," Naomi said. "But you should know what shadows are walking behind you." Ruth's eyes flicked to Miguelito. "He has no name but mine. That man left me on the road like I was trash. If Elia wants to walk away tomorrow, I won't stop him. But no one's taking my boy." Naomi leaned forward. "You think Elia's the kind who walks away?" Ruth didn't answer. Naomi nodded toward the child. "I've seen a lot of women with babies. Some love out of fear, some out of shame. You love like it's the only thing keeping you alive." "It is," Ruth whispered. Naomi placed a warm hand on Ruth's wrist. "Then you'll be fine." The door creaked open, and Elia stepped back in arms dusted with snow, sleeves rolled up. Woods stacked. Naomi grinned, still strong for a hermit. Elia shrugged. "Axes don't talk back." Naomi gestured toward the fire. "Sit. Eat." They ate venison stew with flatbread. Naomi asked Ruth questions between bites where she'd grown up, Durango, what her mother taught her, not enough, what she wanted now. "I want my son to grow up in a place where no one spits at him," Ruth said. "Or looks at him like he's less." Naomi looked at Elia. "And you, what do you want?" He met her eyes without flinching. "I want peace that don't come with a cost." Naomi let out a breath like a laugh. "You won't find that here." "I know," he said. After dinner, Naomi prepared 2 satchels, one with herbs for Miguelito, the other with tools for Ruth. Dried lavender, calendula, cotton root bark, a small wooden mortar and pestle, a bundle of notes she'd copied by hand over years. "You're taking this seriously," Naomi said. "Good, because you'll need more than kindness to survive." Outside, the wind had settled. A heavy quiet pressed down on the forest. Ruth stepped out, baby cradled close, Elia behind her. They began the long walk back up the ridge trail toward the cabin. They didn't speak, not for a while. Then Ruth said, "Why did you bring me here?" Elia didn't answer at first. The snow crunched underfoot. The trees creaked overhead. "I didn't know where else to take you," he said finally. "But she was the only one I trusted with a life that small." Ruth nodded. "I think she sees something in you," he added. "More than you see in yourself." They reached the bend in the trail, where the trees thinned, and the full view of the valley spread out below, layered in white, bathed in moonlight. Miguelito stirred. Ruth adjusted the wrap and kissed his forehead. Elia glanced toward the east ridge. He stopped. "What is it?" Ruth asked. He pointed. Far in the distance, barely visible against the snow, was a flicker of smoke rising where no cabin should be. Someone else was out there. watching. The quiet between their names, where silence begins to speak and Ruth asks the question she's not ready to hear the answer to. The first morning they woke without fear was the first morning that felt like home. There was no fire yet, but the cabin still held the night's warmth. Ruth stirred beneath the wool blanket on the floor, eyes blinking open to pale winter light. Miguelito lay curled beside her cheeks, flushed with sleep, but no longer fevered. He sucked softly in his dreams, lips moving like he still searched for warmth. Elias sat near the hearth, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. The sound was steady scrape, pause, scrape. He did it every morning like a prayer with no words. Ruth had stopped wondering if it was for use or just habit, maybe both. She sat up, brushing hair from her eyes. "Elia," she asked, voice still cracked from sleep. He didn't look up. That smoke we saw the other night. You think someone's tracking us?" He paused. "Could be a trapper. Could be worse." Her stomach twisted. Would they come this high? They wouldn't mean to. But people end up in places they shouldn't all the time. He set down the blade and stood stretching slowly. "We'll check the snare line today. Might be they're already gone." Miguelito stirred, blinking, then let out a tiny, half-formed laugh. Ruth scooped him up, kissed his temple. "He's hungrier now," she said. "He's louder." "That's good," Elias said, grabbing his coat. "Means he wants to live." Ruth smiled faintly. "He always did. I was the one who didn't." Elias didn't respond, just opened the cabin door and stepped outside into the white morning. By the time he returned, Ruth had a pot of cornmeal bubbling on the fire, and Miguelito was chewing on the edge of a rabbit hide pouch. She took it gently from him. "I could do some stitching today," she said. "Maybe fix your coat sleeve." Elias shrugged it off and handed it to her without a word. She sat down near the fire, pulling a needle and gut thread from her small sewing kit. "Elias," she said, not looking up, "why don't you ever ask me anything?" He was stacking kindling near the hearth. He paused mid-motion. "What would I ask? I don't know," she said. "Where I came from. What I want. If I'm staying. You'd tell me if you wanted to." She looked up, frustrated now. "You never ask questions, Elias. That's worse than talking too much." He stood still for a long beat, then sat on the other side of the fire. "You want to stay?" he asked finally. She blinked. "I'm asking now," he said. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I want to stop running." He nodded slowly. "Then that's a start." They worked in silence after that, but it wasn't the cold kind. It was warm, comfortable. That afternoon, Ruth asked Elias to teach her how to set a snare. They hiked the ridge trail together, Miguelito bundled against her chest, watching the woods with wide, blinking eyes. Elias pointed to faint tracks in the snow. Rabbit. Not fresh. Maybe yesterday. He showed her how to bend the sapling, where to place the loop, how to use the animal's own trail to set the trap. She watched every movement carefully. "Why do they come back to the same path?" she asked. "Because it's what they know," he said. "Even if it leads to death," he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Especially then. That night they ate boiled rabbit and drank pine needle tea. Ruth laid Miguelito on the bed for the first time beside a fur Elias had softened with ash and bone oil. He slept there unbothered. Ruth sat at the table sewing a small toy, 2 sticks and a scrap of cloth meant to be a man on horseback. "My father made something like this once," she said. "But he burned it when I asked if girls could ride too." Elias sipped his tea. "You still want to ride?" She smiled. "Now I want to teach him to." Miguelito stirred, then settled. Elia stood and reached for his rifle, checked the chamber, then leaned it back against the door. "I've seen worse men raise better kids," he said. "And I've seen good men ruin them just the same." Ruth nodded. "So what does it take, Cla?" He met her eyes. "Staying." She let that settle in her chest, heavier than expected. Later that night, after the fire had died to coals, Ruth rolled onto her side. "Elia," she whispered. You've lived alone a long time." "Yeah." Why he didn't answer for a while. Then softly, "Because quiet don't lie to you." She turned that over in her mind until sleep came. 3 days later, Naomi arrived unannounced. She walked through the snow like it owed her nothing, a bundle of dried flowers under one arm. "You learn anything yet?" she asked Ruth, not bothering with hellos. "A little," Ruth said, smiling. "I can steep teas, tie bundles, tell poison from fever root." Naomi snorted. "Not bad. You got hands like mine, not soft, not proud." She handed Ruth the bundle. "Choke cherry blossoms. Soak them. Good for grief." Ruth took them carefully. "Thank you." Naomi turned to Elia. "You got visitors coming." His jaw tightened. "Who a trapper passed through Bridger's Pass. Said someone was asking about a woman dark-hair baby alone. Mexican." Ruth's face went pale. Naomi looked between them. "I told him I didn't know any such girl. But I don't know who else he's told." Elia stood already moving toward the door. "I'll check the ridges tomorrow." Naomi stepped in his path. "Check if you want, but you know it won't end at the tree line." Ruth stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Let them come." Naomi narrowed her eyes. "You ready for that?" "No," Ruth said. "But I won't run anymore." Naomi gave a slow nod. "Then you better teach that baby how to hold still when the wind shifts. 'Cause it's shifting." That night, Ruth sat at the window after everyone had gone to sleep. The moon lit the snow outside in soft silver. She could see the ridgeline from here. Nothing moved, but she could feel it, the slow pull of past lives catching up the weight of choices made in silence. She looked down at Miguelito, asleep beside the fire, hands curled like fists around nothing. She whispered into the dark, "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." Men with empty hands talk the loudest, where the world beyond the mountain begins to stir, and not everyone is willing to let the past stay buried. Bridger's Pass smelled of smoke sweat and the kind of whiskey that burned all the way down. The town squatted low between two jagged hills, snow gathering on rooftops, horses tied up along the rail outside the saloon. It was the kind of place people passed through, not stayed unless they had debts to hide or grudges to feed. Inside the forge, heat pulsed against the cold outside. The blacksmith, Jonas McCall, slammed his hammer down on a glowing horseshoe, sparks flying. His face was a hard, square thing, jaw like a cracked rock, eyes pale and mean. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to get others to listen. He dunked the shoe in the barrel, steam rising, then looked up as the door creaked open. A fur-clad trapper stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. "You hear what I heard?" the man said, pulling his gloves off slow. "That old mountain man's got himself a woman up there now. Mexican girl with a baby." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Elia." The trapper grinned. "Mm-hmm. Said he found her on the road, near Froze. Took her in. Been weeks now." Jonas set the horseshoe aside, wiping his hands. He finally lose his mind. "Looks like it. Heard the kid ain't even his." The room went still except for the hiss of the coals. Jonas looked past the trapper through the open door where the snow still fell and said flatly, A man who raises another's blood ain't no man at all. The trapper laughed awkwardly. Hell, maybe he's just lonely. Jonas didn't laugh, didn't smile. Men like that don't get to be lonely, he said. He left the council, left his people, turned his back. Now he's taking in strays like some old priest. The trapper shrugged. He always kept to himself. Jonas leaned forward slightly. Keeping to yourself's one thing. Bringing your shame back into town is another. He grabbed a rag and wiped down his tools movements clipped. You see which way they came from up North Ridge, the trapper said. Cabin past the old cottonwoods. Half a day's ride. Jonas gave a short nod. I'll bring it up at the next council meet. That night inside Naomi's cabin, the air was thick with cedar smoke and tension. She moved around the fire with practiced grace, pouring hot liquid from one jar to another. Ruth sat beside her, watching every motion, baby Miguelito asleep against her back. Naomi broke the silence. Word's spreading. I figured, Ruth said. Eliah's name's being dragged through every fire pit in town, Naomi continued. They're saying he's gone soft, that you bewitched him. Ruth let out a sharp breath, bitter. Wouldn't be the first time someone blamed the woman. Naomi didn't smile. This is different. You're not just a woman. You're an outsider. A mother without a husband, with a child that don't belong to no one in their eyes. He belongs to me, and that don't count to them. Ruth tightened the shawl around her. I didn't ask to be taken in. I didn't ask him for anything. That's not the point, Naomi said. They see your presence as a weakness in him, and weakness is something they don't forgive. Ruth looked toward the door. Will they come? Not yet, Naomi said. But Jonas is stirring the fire. He's got a grudge against Eliah. Always has. What kind of grudge? Naomi stirred the herbs gently. The kind that festers when someone chooses silence over power. Back at the cabin, Eliah stood by the window, cleaning his rifle in the low light. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind had picked up again. It rattled the shutters like old bones. Ruth returned just before dusk, cheeks red from cold, a satchel of dried herbs slung over one shoulder. Naomi says there's talk, she said, brushing snow from her boots. I know, Eliah said. She says Jonas is leading it. I know that too. Ruth frowned. And you're not going to say anything? Eliah looked up slow and steady. Talk ain't worth much unless you need something from it. Maybe, she said. But if they come for us, if they try to take him, they won't. You don't know that. I do. He set the rifle down gently. If they come, they'll come through me. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay awake with Miguelito pressed to her chest, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan through the trees. She thought about the way Naomi had looked at her, not with pity, not even with concern, but with preparation, like a teacher sharpening a student for a test they couldn't avoid. She thought about Jonas, a man she hadn't met, but could feel circling them like a buzzard. And she thought about Eliah, the way he stood still when others ran, the way he said almost nothing, but somehow made her feel more seen than 1,000 words could. She didn't want to lose that. She didn't want to run again. She wouldn't. 3 days later, the council fire burned high in the center of town. Men stood in circles, voices low but charged. The sky was gray snow falling like ash. Jonas McCall stood at the edge of the fire, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't care who the woman is, he said. I care what it means. You let a man like Eliah take in strays, raise a child that ain't his, and call it noble. Then what next? What do we stand for? Naomi stepped forward, arms crossed. We stand for not letting people die in the snow. Jonas sneered. Is that what he was doing, saving lives or hiding behind them? A murmur went through the crowd. Another council member, an older man with a limp, spoke next. Elijah was one of us. Still is, far as I'm concerned. He never brought trouble here. Jonas shook his head. He left. He walked away. And now he's coming back with baggage. That's not quiet anymore. That's a statement. Naomi stepped closer. And what are you making, Jonas, a statement or a threat? The blacksmith's voice dropped. Just asking the council to decide, does a man's name mean anything? Or do we let it be rewritten by strangers? The fire snapped loudly. Naomi looked around at the gathered faces. Then call your vote, she said. Let's see who's brave enough to speak their truth out loud. Back on the mountain, Ruth stood outside the cabin watching the horizon. The clouds moved low and fast, wind brushing her face like a warning. Elijah walked up behind her. Naomi'll send word. She said they're meeting today. They'll talk. They'll argue. Then they'll forget. Ruth turned to face him. What if they don't? Elijah looked past her toward the pass. Then we build a fence. She almost laughed. A fence not to keep people out, he said, to show we're staying. They stood there in the snow for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the trees creak under the weight of winter. Far below in Bridger's Pass, Jonas walked away from the council fire, his boots crunching across frozen mud. His jaw-clenched hands balled into fists. He'd made his play. But Elijah hadn't shown, and that somehow made it worse, because silence could be louder than any threat. And Jonas didn't like being ignored. He would try another way. Words around the fire burn longer. Where Ruth stands for herself and silence meets its first answer in public. The next morning, Ruth found the letter pinned to the cabin door with the tip of a hunting knife. She saw it before she saw the snow piled on the porch rail or the blood on the edge of the blade. Not fresh blood, just dried brown crusted, like it came from a hand that had already done some damage. She reached for it slowly, peeled the parchment away from the door. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged where the cold had frozen it before it dried. You don't belong here. Neither does the boy. Come to the fire and speak or be spoken for. Ruth stared at it, heart pounding in her throat. Her first instinct was to run inside to hold Miguelito to scream for Elijah, but she didn't move. Instead, she reread the note once, twice, then walked down the porch steps, letter in hand, and stood facing the forest. The trees were silent, unmoving. Nothing but snow and wind. She knew what this was. A challenge, a warning, an invitation. Behind her, Elijah appeared in the doorway. Barefoot rifle in hand, hair still mussed from sleep. He looked at the knife, the letter, her face. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. They want me to speak at the fire, she said, not turning. Or they'll decide for me. Elijah exhaled through his nose. They're pushing. They want me gone. They don't get to want. Ruth turned to face him. But they're going to do it anyway. You know they are. He stepped forward slowly, voice calm. You don't have to go down there. I do, she said. I'm not letting them pretend I'm something to be handled. I'll speak, and they'll listen. Elijah looked at her long and quiet. There was something in his eyes then, not fear, not even concern. Just wait, like he knew what it cost to stand in front of people who only wanted to see you fall. You speak, he said. I'll stand with you. No, Ruth said. You'll stay quiet. You've done enough. Elijah's brow furrowed. You don't need to prove anything. Ruth's voice was steady, almost fierce. I'm not proving anything, she said. I'm claiming what's mine. The ride into town was slow, snow-crusted thick on the trail. Ruth rode Elia's mule bundled in layers of wool and leather, Miguelito strapped against her chest. Her fingers were numb before they passed the creek bend. But she didn't stop. She didn't flinch. Naomi was waiting at the edge of Bridger's Pass, leaning against her staff, like she'd been there since dawn. You're sure? She asked as Ruth dismounted. No, Ruth said. But I'm here. Naomi didn't smile, but there was something soft behind her eyes. Then let's go. They walked side by side through the middle of town, people parting without speaking. Stares landed on Ruth like cold ash. Some turned away. Others didn't bother hiding the way their eyes narrowed when they saw the baby. At the fire circle, Jonas McCall stood with arms crossed, flanked by 2 other councilmen. The flames were high, snapping in the wind. Ruth stepped forward, unbuttoned the top of her coat so they could see the baby. Hear him breathing. Speak, Jonas said flatly. You've had your time to hide. Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't even look at Elia, who stood off to the side, rifle slung but unreadable. My name is Ruth Delgado, she began. I came here because I had no choice. I stayed because I made one. Jonas laughed once, short and ugly. This isn't about staying. This is about shame. You show up in a man's cabin with a child that don't belong to anyone but your past and expect us to. He belongs to me. Her voice cut sharp through the cold. And I'm not here to ask. I'm here to speak. She stepped closer to the fire. I didn't come here to break your rules. I came to survive them. I've worked. I've learned. I've asked for nothing but quiet and a place to raise my son. Not your land, someone muttered from the crowd. Not yours either, Naomi snapped back, turning. This was Crow land before you found it worth building on. Jonas ignored her. You think being stubborn earns you something. You think being taken in by a man who forgot his name gives you a seat at our fire. No, Ruth said, but raising a child in a storm, making medicine with bare hands, keeping peace when I wanted to scream that should. The circle quieted. She looked around at the crowd, eyes catching one face at a time. Some softened, some hardened, but none looked away. I'm not asking for your permission, she said. I'm planting my feet, right here. You don't have to like it, but you will live with it. Jonas stepped forward, eyes blazing. You think courage makes you innocent? That a loud voice makes up for what you dragged into this valley. Ruth stared him down. What I dragged into this valley saved a child. What have you done lately but talk loud and cast shadows? A murmur rose from the back of the crowd. Someone chuckled. Then someone else said, She ain't wrong. Jonas turned, scanning the faces, but the tide was already shifting. Ruth took one step back, letting silence speak the rest. Naomi came to her side. You've said enough, she whispered. Let them sit with it. They left the fire without another word. Later, back at the cabin, Elia stood at the porch steps as Ruth approached. Well, he asked. They listened. That's new. Ruth handed him the baby, who giggled and kicked. I said what needed saying, she said. If they come again, they'll have to do more than raise their voices. Elia smiled slightly. You sounded like Naomi. Maybe I'm learning. They stood there a while, snow beginning to fall again. A soft hush wrapped the forest in quiet. Elia finally said, You scared them. Ruth looked up. Good. And then almost to herself she added, a woman who's not afraid of her name is the loudest sound a coward can hear. Inside, she put Miguelito down on the bed. He slept easily now, breathing deep and steady. Elias stoked the fire, then paused. There's something else, he said. Tracks near the eastern ridge. Deeper than usual. Ruth turned slowly. Animal man. She crossed her arms, jaw set. You think Jonas? No, Elias said. Someone else. Watching. Careful. She nodded once. Then we watch back. What the snow covers the snow remembers. Where past footsteps return, and Ruth faces the man who left her behind. The wind had teeth that morning, sharp, biting, relentless. Elias stood at the edge of the ridge, his rifle lowered, but ready eyes scanning the tree line below. Snow coated everything, a thick, undisturbed blanket. But he could feel it. Something was wrong. Tracks had been there yesterday, deep, deliberate boot prints heading west, then looping back toward the cabin. Someone had circled them. He returned before Ruth could worry, though the worry was already on her face when he stepped inside. Miguelito sat on the floor with a carved wooden horse making soft, nonsensical sounds as he pushed it across the fur rug. Anything she asked. He shook his head. Nothing fresh. But he removed his gloves slowly, then looked up at her. Whoever it is, they know where we are. They're waiting. Ruth didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, There's only one person I know who waits like that. Elia's eyes narrowed. The father. She nodded. Raphael. The name lingered in the air like smoke. Miguelito kept playing unaware. I thought he was gone, she said. I thought maybe he'd forget. Elia didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew a man like Raphael didn't forget. He collected debts, even ones he invented. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, turning over a silver bracelet in her hands, the only thing she had left from her mother. Her thumb brushed the inscription inside, worn smooth with time. She hadn't looked at it in months. Maybe longer. Elias sat across from her, sharpening a skinning blade in slow, steady strokes. When he comes, Ruth said, not looking up, I won't hide. Elia nodded. I know. He always said no one would believe me, that if I ran, no one would care. Elias stopped sharpening. His voice was low. You think he's right? She met his eyes. No, she said. Not anymore. In the early hours, while the snow still whispered outside, Ruth stepped onto the porch with a lantern. The wind tore at her shawl, but she didn't flinch. She walked to the edge of the clearing where the trees began and pressed the bracelet into the snow. A message. She left it there. 2 days later, the storm broke. The sky was pale blue and the sun shone weak but clear. Ruth and Elia walked the trapline together. Miguelito stayed behind asleep in Naomi's arms. They said little. At the third snare, they found a rabbit freshly caught, already stiff. Elia crouched to release it. Do you think he'll come here? Ruth asked. Yes. When soon? They walked back in silence. But when they returned to the cabin, Ruth stopped short. The door was open, not wide, just slightly enough to catch the wind. Elia pushed in first, rifle raised. Naomi stood inside, holding Miguelito calm as ever. Thought I'd light the fire while you were gone, she said. You're running low on birch. But Elia moved past her, scanning the walls, the shelves, the floor. Then he saw it. By the hearth in the ash, a boot print. Not Naomi's, not Ruth's, and not his. He crouched slowly, fingertips brushing the edge. Ruth moved to his side. That's his. Elia looked up at her. You sure I slept beside that print for 2 years? She whispered. I'm sure. Naomi's voice came from behind. Then he's not warning anymore. He's choosing where to shoot from. That night, Ruth couldn't keep still. She paced. She cleaned the same pot 3 times. She checked the shutters again and again, though they were latched tight. Elia finally stood from his chair and stepped in front of her. You want to run? She shook her head. No. You want to fight? Another shake. I want him to see me standing. I want him to see that I made a life without him. Elia nodded once slow. You will, he said. Then softly, you already have. The next morning, Ruth went out alone. She didn't tell Elia. She didn't tell Naomi. She carried nothing but the bracelet in her pocket and a slingshot tucked into her belt, the same one she'd used to scare crows from the cornfields when she was 12. She walked into the trees like they were hers, and before long she found him. Raphael. He was leaning against a rock outcrop, arms crossed, rifle slung over one shoulder. He hadn't aged much, same cruel smile, same posture, like the world owed him its gaze. Took you long enough, he said. She didn't smile. You've been sniffing around for days. You could have just knocked. He chuckled. I wasn't sure how welcome I'd be. You're not, she said. But you're here anyway. He nodded, eyes flicking over her. I heard you had a baby. Heard some old trapper took you in like a stray dog. You should have kept riding. He stepped closer. He mine. She didn't blink. He's not yours, she said. He's never been yours. Raphael's eyes darkened. You sure about that? I'm sure enough to kill you if you come near him. He laughed. You gonna shoot me with that slingshot? Ruth's hand went to her belt, but she didn't draw. Instead, she said, I buried the girl you broke in a snowstorm last winter. This woman standing in front of you, she'll set fire to the whole damn mountain before she lets you near that child. Raphael's jaw tightened. You think people are gonna protect you? She stepped closer. No, she said. I'll protect myself. They stood like that for a long moment, frozen in place like 2 wolves testing the wind. Then slowly, Raphael backed away. You've changed, he said. No, she replied. You just never bothered to look. He turned and vanished into the trees. Ruth stood there breathing hard, chest burning with cold and fury, and something else, something quieter. Relief. When she returned, Elia was on the porch. He said nothing, just looked at her. Her hair was wild, her cheeks red, but her eyes, they were sharp. Steady. You saw him, he said. She nodded. He'll come back, Elia warned. Let him, she said. He studied her for a moment longer, then said softly, What the snow covers, the snow remembers. Inside, Naomi handed Miguelito to her with a smile. He cried once, she said, then stopped, like he knew you were doing something that mattered. Ruth held him tight. I was. That night, Ruth lit the fire herself. She boiled herbs. She mended a tear in Elia's coat. She sang to her son, not to calm him, but to calm herself, because a storm was coming again. And this time she wasn't going to hide from it. Where fire gathers, truth demands a witness. A reckoning begins, and Ruth learns that her fight is not just for her own life, but for the kind of world her son will grow up in. The fire started small, just a single flame in the darkness. Ruth didn't even see who lit it first. She only saw the glow in the distance flickering behind the pine trees, calling like a warning or a summons. Elia was already up when she turned from the window. He stood by the door, loading cartridges into his rifle without a word. Ruth wrapped Miguelito tighter in the woven sling across her chest and moved toward him. "They want to talk," Elia said, eyes never leaving the chamber. "Then let them say it to my face." He paused at that, looked at her. Her voice wasn't raised, but it held the kind of calm that followed storms, not silence. It was the voice of someone who had made peace with what had to come next. "You don't have to go," he said. Ruth tightened her coat. "I do, but you don't." He closed the chamber with a quiet click. "I'm not sending you out there alone." The wind outside had teeth again, but the snow had stilled. The world held its breath. They walked through the trees without speaking, Naomi trailing behind with her staff, her own face set with something harder than usual. By the time they reached the clearing, the fire had grown tall flames licking at the low-hung branches of a dead pine. A half-circle of people stood gathered. Men, women, council elders. And Jonas standing at the front, arms crossed like he'd been waiting years for this moment. Ruth stepped forward, and all eyes turned to her. Jonas didn't speak right away. He just stared at her, then at the child pressed to her chest, then at Elia, standing just behind her, a hand resting on the butt of his rifle. "You should have left," Jonas said finally. "I'm not leaving," Ruth replied. "This ain't your land. It became mine the day I decided to live." Murmurs from the crowd, not all hostile, some confused, some watching, waiting. "You came here broken," Jonas said louder now. "You came with nothing. And now you think that standing in front of a fire makes you part of us," she said. "But I've bled on your soil. I've fed from your streams. I've watched my child heal here. And I've stood beside the only man in this valley who knows what silence is for." She turned her eyes to the rest of the circle. "You all came from somewhere. Some of you ran. Some of you were chased. So did I." "You ran from your own shame," Jonas snapped. "I ran from a man who hit me while whispering love. I ran from a town that told me to smile while I stitched up my own bruises. I ran with a baby in my belly and a prayer in my throat, and somehow I made it here." Naomi stepped beside her. "Let them hear you now. They built this fire to burn something. Make them burn their fear instead." Jonas took a step forward. "That man," he pointed at Elia, "he was once one of us. A good one. A tracker. A builder. But he lost his spine for a soft voice and a bastard child." Elia didn't move, but Ruth did. She turned and slowly, looked at Elia, then looked back at Jonas. "You think loving someone makes him weak?" she said. "You think raising a child not born of your blood is shameful? Then you've never known real strength." Jonas spat into the snow. "We have rules here. Then rewrite them." Gasps, sharp murmurs. No one had ever said it that plainly. Jonas glared. "You don't get to change what was built before you." "No," Ruth said, "but I get to fight for what comes after." She stepped closer to the fire, the heat brushing her cheeks. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every woman who ever walked into a room and had to defend her right to stay, every child born on the wrong side of someone else's idea of order, every man who traded power for peace." Naomi nodded, her voice low but firm. "Where fire gathers, truth demands a witness." Elia finally stepped forward then. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the circle like a clean edge. "I left the council," he said, "because I saw what fear does to men, how it turns them into gatekeepers instead of guardians." He looked straight at Jonas. "You want to protect this valley, then start by listening to those who found it worth saving." She did that. "Not you." Jonas's jaw clenched. "You defending her doesn't make her right." "No," Elia said, "but it means you're not the only voice here." Silence followed. Long. Weighty. Then one of the council elders stepped forward, Thomas Greyhorse, a man old enough to remember when the valley had no boundaries. He looked at Ruth, then at Miguelito. "I remember when Elia was just a boy," Thomas said. "He used to ask questions about what made a man good. Not strong, not loud, just good." He paused, voice steady. "Seems to me he finally found an answer." Then he looked back at the fire. "This woman isn't just here to survive. She's here to build something. And if we don't see that, we're blinder than the snowstorm that buried the pass in '68. Jonas shook his head. "You're siding with them, I'm siding with what's right." More murmurs. Then a younger man, Sam Weller, one of the newer settlers, spoke up. "If she can survive a winter up here with nothing but grit and herbs, maybe we should be asking her to teach us something." A few chuckles. A few nods. Jonas looked around and saw the shift. He wasn't losing control, he'd already lost it. But pride dies slow. "This isn't over," he muttered. "No," Ruth said. "It's just starting." And then she stepped back from the fire, held her child close, and turned her back on Jonas. She didn't need to stay and hear more. She'd said what mattered. Later that night, back in the cabin, the fire crackled low. Naomi brewed tea while Elia fixed a loose shutter. Ruth sat with Miguelito in her lap, humming a soft tune. She wasn't shaking. Not anymore. "He won't stop," Naomi warned. "Men like that don't like being silenced." "He can keep yelling," Ruth said. "I'm not listening." Elia set down his tools and looked at her across the room. "You were louder than any fire tonight." She smiled, tired but certain. "Not loud, just clear." Outside, the wind had changed again, softer this time. Like even the mountain had heard her. No one teaches you how to bury a father. Where Ruth's past returns, not in rage but in grief, and the next battle she must fight is for the heart she thought she'd already buried. It started with a knock that didn't belong. Not loud, not rushed. Just 3 slow, deliberate taps on the cabin door, as the morning mist still clung to the trees. Ruth was nursing Miguelito by the fire, half asleep, her body exhausted from the night before. Elia had gone to check the traps before dawn. Naomi was up the ridge gathering moss for tinctures. No one was supposed to be there. She rose carefully, laying Miguelito in the cradle Elia had built from pine and worn rope. She reached for the small rifle above the mantel, then moved toward the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice steady. A man's voice, low and rough with dust, replied, someone looking to bury what was never finished. She froze. She knew that voice. It wasn't Raphael. It was someone further back, someone she hadn't thought of in years because she'd worked so hard to forget. Her father. She opened the door slowly. He stood there, hunched from the saddle, wrapped in an old serape boots worn down to the soles. His beard was gray now, longer than it used to be. His eyes, still the same piercing black, softened when they landed on her. "Ruth." She didn't answer. "You gonna let me in?" he asked. She stepped aside in silence. Not out of forgiveness, just shock. He limped in and lowered himself onto the edge of the wooden bench near the door, like a man who had walked more years than he'd lived. Ruth shut the door behind him and leaned her rifle against the wall. He looked around, slow, quiet, respectful. "This yours?" he asked, nodding toward the cradle. She didn't answer. He nodded anyway. "Looks like you did all right. Better than I thought." She crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" he exhaled. "Because I'm dying." She blinked. He smiled faintly. "Well, that's one way to start a visit." "I'm not sure I care," she said, voice cold. "I wouldn't expect you to." He looked at her again, that long, quiet gaze fathers think they've earned. "I came to say sorry. And goodbye." She laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You think they go together?" "No," he said. "But it's the best I've got left." She didn't let him stay the night. She sent him to Naomi's hut, who raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Naomi always knew what silence meant before words filled it. When Elia returned, she told him everything. The name, the face, the weight of old words not yet spoken. "He used to pray over my mother's grave," she said. "Then come inside and slap the mercy out of me." Elia listened without speaking, as he always did. "I used to think maybe if I just stood still long enough I'd become someone else," Ruth whispered. "Something smaller, easier to love." Elia took her hand, calloused fingers warm against hers. "You're not small now," he said. She nodded. "That's the problem. He came back to talk to the girl he remembers, but she's gone." The next day her father returned, this time without knocking. He stood outside while Ruth chopped wood behind the cabin. Miguelito sat nearby in a blanket chewing on a stick. "You didn't even write," she said, sweat on her brow, arms swinging clean through the pine log. "I figured I lost the right." "You did." "I know." He watched her work. "I don't want anything." "You want to die clean," she corrected. "You want peace before the dirt covers you." He nodded. "I do." She leaned on the axe. "Then tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Just once." He looked down at the snow. "I thought I was saving you," he said. "From your mother's softness. From my shame. From the world that eats women like her whole. You became the thing she feared most. I know. And now you're here." He met her eyes. "I came to die near something that was good," once he said. "And I know I'm not owed forgiveness. But I am owed the telling of it. That's all I have left." She didn't respond. He sat on a stump, breathing like it hurt. "I beat you because I couldn't beat my own reflection. I shouted at you because I couldn't hear myself. I blamed you for things you didn't do because I couldn't fix the things I had done." She crossed her arms. "I still hate you," she said. "I still love you," he replied. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Ruth said, "Miguelito's not his. He's mine. I made him. I raised him. And no man gets to claim him except the one who stands with him when he's scared." Her father nodded. "That's more father than I ever was." She blinked hard, turned away. Later by the fire, Naomi leaned toward her. "You don't have to carry his weight." "I know," Ruth said, "but I do have to decide if I let him put it down." Naomi stirred the pot. "Sometimes closure is a shovel, not a key." That night, Ruth sat by the window, Miguelito asleep in her lap. Elia sat beside her. "You want me to send him away?" she said. "He came to bury a version of me that no longer exists, and I think I need to watch him do it." In the morning, her father asked to see the child. Just once. She hesitated but nodded. He didn't reach out, didn't try to touch him, just looked at Miguelito sleeping in the cradle. "He's beautiful," he said. Ruth nodded. "Do you think he'll remember me?" "No," she said. "And that's mercy." He nodded, stood slowly, and walked out. He died 2 days later in Naomi's hut. Quiet, no pain, no ceremony. Ruth helped bury him near the river bend where the snow thinned just enough to break the earth. She placed a stone at his feet. Not for honor, but for record. Elia stood beside her. Naomi said the words, and Ruth whispered something into the wind. No one teaches you how to bury a father. You just have to survive the day it happens. That night, Ruth sat by the fire, Miguelito pressed against her chest. Elia poured tea. Naomi stitched a patch on an old blanket. And for the first time in years, Ruth felt something settle in her chest. Not forgiveness, not peace, but room for whatever came next. If you're still breathing, you're still becoming. Where Ruth must decide not what she's escaped, but what kind of future she wants to claim. The thaw came slow that spring. Snow melted in patches, reluctant to let go, like a story too long held onto. The creek behind the cabin began to run again, slow at first, then steady, carving its way through the ice like it remembered the shape of the earth underneath. Ruth stood at the water's edge, boots sunk into the soft mud, Miguelito strapped to her chest. He watched the stream with wide eyes, fingers tangled in her braid. Behind her, Elia repaired the fence that had fallen under the last heavy snow. Naomi was up the hill with her herbs collecting the first shoots of green that had dared to rise from the cold. The world was moving again. But Ruth stood still. "You ever feel like your body's healing faster than your mind?" she asked quietly. Elia didn't look up from the fence. "Every damn day." She smiled, faint and crooked. "Feels strange. Like the quiet is louder now." Elia straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, and came to stand beside her. "That's 'cause you ain't running anymore." She nodded. But there was something in her eyes. Not sadness. Not fear. Just hunger. The kind that comes after too many years of going without. "Elia," she said, "what if I want more?" He raised an eyebrow. "More what? More than surviving? More than hiding up here and hoping the past doesn't find me again?" He studied her. "What do you want?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, worn and creased. She handed it to him. He opened it. It was a flyer, tattered, water-stained. A notice from Town 1 he hadn't seen before. School opening in Bridgers Pass. Seeking teachers, herbalists, people willing to pass down what they know. Ruth met his eyes. "Naomi said I know enough to teach. She offered to go with me. Just a few days a week." Elia looked at the paper again. "And Miguelito. She'd watch him when I go. Or I bring him. He's old enough now to sit still a little, learn how to be around people." Elia looked at her. Really looked, and saw the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from wanting. "You afraid they'll still judge you?" he asked. "I'm afraid they won't," she said. That gave him pause. "Why? Because if they don't, then I don't have an excuse anymore." Elia smiled, quiet and deep. "If you're still breathing, you're still becoming." Ruth laughed softly. "Did you just make that up?" He shrugged. "Maybe." She folded the paper again, slid it back into her coat. "I think I want to try." He nodded. "Then you should." She looked at him sideways. You think they'll listen? I think you'll make 'em. The next morning, Ruth packed her satchel. Herbs, books, Naomi's notes, a small wooden toy for Miguelito. She wore her thickest shawl and tied her hair back tight. They rode down the mountain together, Ruth, Elia, and Naomi. The pass was muddy but passable. Trees had started to bud. Birds returned to the sky. The earth creaked with new life. Bridger's Pass looked different than it had in winter. Less harsh, less guarded. The buildings still leaned like old men, but there were more people now. Women with baskets, children chasing chickens, men hauling timber. It looked like a place where something might grow. Ruth dismounted outside the old church hall where the notice had pointed. Miguelito clung to her hip wide-eyed. Naomi squeezed her arm. Go on. I'll watch him. Ruth swallowed, then stepped inside. The room was small, dusty, filled with benches and mismatched chairs. A woman stood near the front, tall, silver-haired, with hands that looked like they'd once held more weight than books. You here for the position? The woman asked. I'm Ruth, she said. I know healing, wild herbs, a little reading and writing. The woman nodded. Can you keep children quiet? Not mine, Ruth said, then caught herself and smiled. But maybe others. The woman laughed. Then you're already better than half the folks who've tried. They talked for a while. Ruth explained what she knew. How Naomi had taught her how she'd practiced on broken arms and colds and winter fevers. The woman asked her to come back Thursday, to try a lesson with the youngest ones. As Ruth left the hall, the sky had cleared. Miguelito squealed when he saw her arms open. She lifted him high and kissed his cheek. You did it, Naomi said. No, Ruth replied. I started. They stayed the night in town, a small room above the general store. Elia stood at the window as Ruth tucked Miguelito into the cot. He didn't cry once today, she said. He knew you were where you needed to be. She turned to face him. Elia, do you ever think about the kind of world we're giving him every day? And I think it's better now that you're in it. She crossed the room and leaned against him. He wrapped his arms around her and rested his chin on her head. I used to think survival was enough, she whispered. And now, I want joy. I want mornings with coffee and laughter. I want to plant something and watch it grow. I want Miguelito to look back and not remember running, only rising. Elia kissed her forehead. Then we rise. Thursday came. Ruth stood in front of a circle of wide-eyed children with scraped knees and runny noses. She showed them dried chamomile, told them how to steep it for sleep. She told them stories about wind and snow and the way trees listened when you were quiet long enough. Some listened, some didn't. But one little girl, red hair, missing front teeth, stared at Ruth like she was magic. When the class ended, that same girl tugged on Ruth's coat. Did you really live in the woods? Ruth nodded. Did you fight a bear? Only once, she said, grinning. The girl beamed. You're like a hero. Ruth's throat caught. No, she said softly. I'm just someone who kept walking. That night, back on the mountain, Ruth sat by the fire, Miguelito asleep in her lap. Elia played with a knife, carving shapes into a scrap of wood. Naomi was snoring quietly in the corner. The wind outside was gentle. You ever think this would happen? She asked Elia. No, me neither. He held up the carving, a bird in flight. For your desk, he said. She took it, fingers brushing the tiny wings. You think I can be both? She asked. Teacher and mother, healer and fighter. He looked at her and smiled. You already are. And she knew then, not in the way you know a fact, but in the way your bones finally settle after a long walk, that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming, still breathing, still becoming. The only thing the fire couldn't burn was her name. Where the past returns one final time, and Ruth must choose between vengeance and the voice she's finally earned. The fire came in the dead of night. Ruth woke to the scent, first burnt pine and scorched earth, and then to Elijah shaking her shoulder hard, his voice low and urgent. "Get the baby," he said. "Now." Smoke bled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Outside, a glow pulsed in the sky like a second dawn, orange and terrible. Naomi was already at the door, staff in hand, eyes wide with a fury Ruth had never seen. "Elijah," she said, "the barn's gone." He didn't answer. Just grabbed the rifle from the mantel, checked the chamber, and slung it over his shoulder. Ruth bundled Miguelito in a thick quilt and held him tight against her chest. The baby stirred, then settled, face pressed into her collarbone. She looked Elijah in the eye. Who, she asked. He didn't need to say it. She already knew. Raphael. The barn was ash when they reached it. Flames still curled along the fence line, snapping like wild dogs. The goats had escaped, bleeding from the tree line. The mule was gone, thank God it had run. Nothing else was left, and in the middle of the smoke stood a figure. Tall, still, watching. Ruth's hands trembled as she passed Miguelito to Naomi, then stepped forward. "Elijah," she said. He raised the rifle. "Wait," she said. "Not yet." She stepped into the firelight. Raphael didn't move. "You came back," she said. He smiled. Not kindly. "Thought I'd leave you a little goodbye. You could have killed us, I didn't. But you tried." He shrugged. "You left me with nothing. I left you with everything I couldn't carry anymore." His eyes narrowed. "You think that boy makes you untouchable?" "No," she said. "But he made me unafraid." Raphael took a step closer. Elijah moved fast, rifle raised and aimed clean between Raphael's eyes. "One more step," he said. But Ruth lifted her hand. "Elijah." Elijah's finger curled tighter on the trigger. "He burned our barn." "I know," she said. "He put your life at risk." "I know." "Then let me end it." Ruth turned her back to Raphael and looked at Elijah, steady and unblinking. "If we end him here, this land stays scorched." Elijah's jaw tensed. "He won't stop." "He will," she said, "because I'm not running anymore. And if he comes back again, it won't be us digging the grave." She turned back to Raphael. "I could kill you right now," she said, "and no one would question it. But I'm not giving you that kind of power over what I've built." Raphael's mouth twisted into something like confusion, like disbelief. "You think this makes you noble?" he asked. "No," she said. "It makes me free." Behind her, Naomi whispered. The only thing the fire couldn't burn was her name. Raphael stared at Ruth, at the baby wrapped in the quilt, at the man holding a loaded rifle with ice in his eyes. Then he spit into the dirt and turned his back. He walked into the woods without another word. Ruth didn't move until his footsteps vanished. Then she turned to Elijah and Naomi. "I'm tired of reacting," she said. "It's time we choose what happens next." Naomi nodded. "Then you lead." The next day the townsfolk came. Not to judge, not to gawk, but to help. Sam Weller brought wood. Mrs. Hensley brought a cradle she'd carved herself just in case Miguelito needed a new one. Thomas Greyhorse brought his sons to rebuild the barn frame. Ruth stood in the doorway as they worked, heart-tight, eyes stinging. They came, she whispered. Elia stood beside her. Because they saw you. That night, with the baby asleep and the cabin warm again, Ruth sat by the fire and held her journal in her lap. She hadn't written in months. Now she picked up the pencil and wrote, "Today I chose not to destroy what tried to destroy me. And somehow I'm still standing, still breathing, still becoming." She paused, then added one more line. "And for the first time, I'm building something that lasts. You don't have to be whole to be chosen." Where Ruth finds that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and love doesn't wait for perfection. The sun rose slow over the ridge, spilling amber light across the fields like a blessing. Snow had long melted, and where the barn once stood, new wood reached toward the sky, unfinished, but sturdy, framed with the kind of care that only hands touched by hardship could build. Ruth stood barefoot in the grass, morning dew clinging to her skin. Miguelito toddled in a crooked circle near her, chasing a moth that danced above the tall grass. His laughter carried on the wind, high, free, full of a joy she hadn't known how to dream of a year ago. Naomi stepped out onto the porch, her shawl around her shoulders, hair silver and still wild. "You letting him chase bugs?" "Now," she called out, smiling. "He's fast enough to keep up," Ruth replied, "and smart enough to know which ones bite." From behind the cabin, Elia appeared with a bucket in one hand and 2 eggs in the other. "He caught a chicken yesterday," he said, grinning. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Caught or scared it stiff?" "He's your son," Elia said. "Bit of both." They laughed easy, unguarded, the way people laugh when they've stopped waiting for the next blow. Later, Ruth walked down to the creek alone. The water ran clear, the sound of it smooth and rhythmic like breath. She crouched by the edge and dipped her fingers in, watching the ripples stretch and vanish. She remembered the first time she came here. Cold, brittle, bleeding inside in ways she didn't have words for. Back then, she hadn't dared to imagine this future. She hadn't thought she'd make it to the next season, let alone wake up in a home that wasn't built from fear. Now she touched the water and smiled. Behind her, the sound of small feet on soft earth. Miguelito toddled up and reached for her hand. She lifted him onto her lap, and they sat there together, quiet, watching the current carry tiny leaves downstream. "Mama," he said, pointing at the trees. "Wind." "That's right," she whispered. "The trees are talking." He looked up at her with wide eyes. "What they sayin'?" She paused, then said, "They're saying you're safe now, that you belong." He leaned his head against her chest, and she held him there, her heartbeat steady beneath his ear. That night, the town held a gathering. No occasion, no reason. Just folks bringing food, music, stories. A fire was built in the middle of the square, and benches circled it like spokes on a wheel. Children ran barefoot. Elders traded tales. The air smelled of pinewood smoke and cinnamon bread. Ruth sat beside Naomi and watched it all unfold. Thomas Greyhorse stood at the center and clapped his hands for silence. "I've been here near 40 years, he said, "and I've seen folks come and go. Some left this valley with more than they brought. Some gave us nothing but trouble." He looked toward Ruth. "And some brought more than we deserved." People turned toward her. She stood slowly. "I came here broken," she said, voice low but firm. "Not just in body, but in spirit. I came hiding from a man, from my past, from myself." No one interrupted. "I thought survival was the best I could hope for. That peace was too much to ask. But then someone gave me a place to sleep. Someone else gave me herbs and knowledge. Another gave me silence when I needed it most. And one man gave me the kind of love that doesn't ask to be earned." She looked down at her son beside her. And now I know something I didn't before. You don't have to be whole to be chosen. You just have to keep choosing. To stay. To try again. To build when you're tired. To love even when you're afraid. Silence stretched around the fire. Then someone clapped. Then another. And then all of them. That night Ruth danced. Not like someone watched. Not like someone judged. But like someone who had finally come home. Elia held her hands as they moved, neither graceful nor practiced, but real. You remember the first time I saw you, he asked. You barely looked at me. I looked. I just didn't believe someone like you would stay. She rested her head on his chest. I didn't believe it either. Naomi joined them on the dance floor later, pulling Thomas along and cackling as he tried to keep up. The kids formed a ring and chased each other around the fire, their laughter echoing into the hills. Ruth stepped back for a moment, holding Miguelito against her hip, watching the circle move. This wasn't the end of the story. Not really. There would still be winters, still be grief, still be days when the wind howled like it wanted to take everything back. But this moment, this one they had earned. When the fire burned low and the stars hung like lanterns in the sky, Ruth walked up the hill to their cabin. She tucked Miguelito into bed and kissed his forehead. Outside, Naomi fed the coals. Elia cleaned the rifle with quiet hands. Ruth lit a single candle and pulled out the journal she had carried for months, the pages worn soft with use. She wrote, "This is how it ends. Not in flight, not in fire, but in choosing to stay, in choosing to build, in choosing to believe that I am more than what tried to break me." She paused, then added, "And in the eyes of my son I see something I never saw in my own reflection, a future that isn't afraid." She closed the book, blew out the candle, and let the night wrap around her not like a threat, but like a quilt stitched by patient hands. They didn't have everything, but they had enough. And for the first time in her life, Ruth believed that was exactly what she deserved.